the actual reason I'm here this morning. Actually, the actual reason I'm here this morning is because I'm the youth pastor and it's a holiday weekend. And if you grew up in church, you kind of know how that goes. But I am excited because we are wrapping up I don't know why I keep favoring this screen. This screen's great too. We are wrapping up our series on the hero's journey. And I was thinking this week as I was watching a show with my kids. We were watching Elmo and Grouchland. Classic. And I actually couldn't tell you anything about this movie, but there was one little kind of throwaway part that stood out. And just to give you some context, have you ever seen like Mystery Science Theater? You know, where like you're watching a movie of some goofy characters watching a movie and like making commentary on it. If you've not, hopefully my description there clarified it. But this is sort of set up in that way. And classic Sesame Street duo Bert and Ernie are watching the movie that we are also watching, and every now and then they'll pause it and they'll kind of comment on it. And if you're not familiar with Bert and Ernie, they're kind of like oil and water a little bit in a really endearing way. But about 2/3 of the way through the movie, things are going badly for Elmo and the rest of the Sesame Street gang. And I actually don't know what's happening. I just know it's going badly. And Bert was he's like, pause, time out. And he comes up and he's like, Ernie, this is terrible. This is bad. Like they're gonna lose, or I don't know. I think Elmo's blanket was stolen. I think that's kind of like the plot of the movie. But so it's looking like Elmo's not gonna get his blanket back. And Ernie's like, Bert, calm down. Stories have happy endings, and if we haven't gotten to the happy ending yet, that just means it's not the end. And that sounds nice, right? But it's not good enough for Bert, because he pauses for a minute and his brow, single brow, kind of furrows. And he says, well, Ernie, what about Titanic? And Ernie's like trying to push him off screen as fast as he can. And Bert goes on to list like 6 other movies. Like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And it got me thinking, some of the best movies, some of the movies that I think ring most true to our experiences of life don't have happy endings. And it got me thinking again, and I say this cautiously because I see my good friend Joe Sweeney in the back, and I know we don't necessarily feel the same way about this character arc. I didn't tell him I was going to say that, so he's freaking out right now. But it got me thinking about one of my favorite heroes and the way that his story ended. And that hero is Luke Skywalker. Rewind, a number of decades ago, end of Return of the Jedi, the 3rd film in the original Star Wars trilogy, and things are looking pretty solid for Luke, or at least they kind of end on a high note. I mean, to say nothing about the fact that he finds out that his father is actually a space Nazi, and then he has to kill him in order to save the galaxy. There's some trauma there, no doubt. But in the end, Luke defeats Darth Vader, and the rebels defeat the Empire, and the Ewoks defeat the Empire as well, and it's all good. Everyone's happy, and then they see some ghosts, and then so for 30 years we were left to just kind of live with that and kind of imagine, okay, Luke, he's kind of come into his own, and now he's this super awesome, space warrior, and he probably is off, swashbuckling with malevolent aliens, and it's going to be great. And he's probably just transcended his physical body, and he's just like the pure embodiment. I don't know, cool fanboy stuff. And then we get the movie The Last Jedi, the second movie in the reboot of the Star Wars trilogy, and that is not what happened to Luke. Because like I said, trauma. His dad was a space Nazi and blew up planets with billions of people on them, and Luke had to find that out, and then pretty quickly after that, in a period of, for us, about 90 minutes, and for him, I don't know, a few years, come to terms with that, and then see him die, and then try to make peace with that, and also found out that the girl that he was into is his sister, and some other stuff happened. It was a lot of trauma. And so in a surprising, but ultimately, I think, deeply realistic turn, where do we find Luke? he's depressed on an isolated island waiting to die. And that threw me. It really did. And I didn't love it at first, but I went back and I watched it again, and I watched it like 7 more times, and pretty quickly the truth of it began to kind of overcome or supersede my expectations. And in many ways, my experience was not unlike what Luke himself tells Rey, the new heroine in the Star Wars trilogy. He says, this isn't going to go the way you think. And I think that's good advice. That's a good thing to realize as we wrap up this series, and as we think about endings, as we think about the way that journeys end and sometimes begin again. But kind of as we get to what they say in kind of the philosophical world, the quilting point, the point at which things end and things are kind of quilted together, and only then can you kind of see the totality. Only then does the meaning kind of emerge and kind of burst forth. And often, when that happens, things have not gone the way that we expected. Now, real quick, just by way of recap, like I said, final week. I think we have a graphic we can kind of throw up that our very own Sean Bowers-Buxton drew of the hero's journey. Beautiful. And you can see the last 2 sections is what we're going to be looking at this morning, the idea of atonement and return. And I want to camp on this word atonement for a second, because atonement, if you grew up in church, you probably heard atonement a lot. You heard about different theories of atonement trying to explain the way that Jesus saves us on the cross. And there's some really bad theories around that. Some ones that maybe make God look not so cool and make us look significantly less cool than that, and kind of awful, and they're not great. And I would even venture to guess that there are people here maybe in this room or outside or at least affiliated with Watershed on some level who are here precisely because you grew up with some bad atonement theories. And you're here to hopefully maybe find a better way of looking at that whole dynamic. But the word atonement, kind of at its root, like etymologically, it's fun to say, it goes kind of back, kind of roughly translating to this idea of unity or oneness, at one-ment. There was a cool Latin way of saying it. It sounded like a Harry Potter spell, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But it means unity. It means wholeness. It means oneness. And I kind of want to undermine that whole deal, because it worries me a little bit. All right, it worries me a little bit because I think, as well-meaning and hopeful as this idea of oneness and unity and wholeness and stuff is, I think one, it doesn't always map to reality. It doesn't always map to our experiences, and I might even suggest it doesn't always map to the being of God. But then beyond that, because it doesn't map, but because we think it's this thing that we need to be pursuing, we end up causing a lot of trauma and doing a lot of damage in our pursuit of it. That's kind of my thesis this morning, and I want to tie it to this other word. That's more of a political word, ideology. Now, I think this word gets thrown around a lot, kind of just in general discourse, like, oh, that person they're just knee deep in conservative ideology or liberal ideology or whatever. That's not what this sermon's about. The definition I want to give you is this: ideology is anything that sort of obscures or covers over the inherent contradictions in reality and life, perhaps even in God. And some examples, perhaps. One example of ideology, especially in this country, might be meritocracy. So we look out, we see contradiction. We see perfectly good people who for whom life is not going well. Maybe they're experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness. Maybe they're experiencing joblessness, something like that, some form of poverty. And what meritocracy does is it gives us an easy, simple explanation for why that is. They didn't try hard enough in school, or they're just not a hard worker. They're lazy. They're, fill in the blank. And sometimes we're not even doing this maliciously or malevolently. It's kind of we're grasping. We're like, well, there must be some logical explanation as to why life is going badly for this person. And so the first thing that we can find that's like, oh yeah, that must be it. It's ideological. Race works this way. In fact, race was invented for this reason, to justify racism, which it creates a narrative of justification for exploitation. It's ideological. It gives us an easy explanation as to why the exploitation and the oppression that we are inflicting on a particular group of people is justified, or at the very least, understandable. Ideology. And my worry with atonement, as well-meaning as it is that atonement can sort of serve an ideological purpose. It allows us to say that, okay, things aren't good now, but they'll be good if, they'll be good when. Maybe they'll be good if we can just get back to the way things were. And this maps to the hero's journey. I mean, we're talking about return today. So if we can just get back to the beginning, we'll be good. Or we know what the right future is. And if we can just get to it, everything will finally be okay. And the worry for me is when you have that kind of certainty in what the good looks like, it's a hop, skip, and a jump away from the ends justifying the means. And inevitably, and I'm going to say it's inevitably when the sort of unity or wholeness or oneness that we think is right and true and inevitable doesn't transpire, then the temptation then is to inflict all sorts of trauma and violence. I guess then my thesis is existence is traumatic. Our pursuit of atonement is an attempt to deal with that, and we typically do it in ideological ways. And the challenge as a people, as a humanity, is to on some level make peace or reconcile ourselves with the trauma of existence. Otherwise, we are going to inflict endless, unnecessary trauma on ourselves and on one another. There's a Bible passage that I think illustrates this well. It's in the book of Mark at the very end. It's going to be up on the screen. It's going to be Mark chapter 16. We're going to start in verse 5. I'll pull it out here myself. Here it is. Oh, my app's reloading. Here it is. Okay. So, starting in verse 5. Just a little context first. So, Jesus died, and it's been a few days, and some of his followers, some of his people are heading to the tomb because they want to make his dead body smell better. And they're worried because there's this big rock in front of it. And they don't know how they're gonna move the rock. And they get there, and lo and behold, it is open. The tomb, the rock is moved. And so that's where we're picking up the story. Verse 5. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. Very casually, Weird kid. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out, fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. They were traumatized. And that's how it ends. That's the end of Mark. Later, they added some stuff because they were like, that can't be the ending. It ends with, they were frightened, they were scared, they were traumatized. And I think that's right. Because here's the thing. The God, at least in the book of Mark, which is my favorite, the God revealed in Jesus on the cross, there's a trauma to that. If our understanding of God is on some level identified and revealed in Jesus, and I'm sort of staking myself on that, then there's a sense in which this is not going to play out the way we think. If God is saying, I am most revealed in this scandalously crucified criminal on the cross, if God is saying, yeah, that's me, then, well, on one hand, there's a freedom in that. What do I mean by that? There's a freedom because I think too often we do think we know that the way this is going to play out. This goes back to the whole ideology atonement thing. We do know for sure how this is supposed to end, and that sort of orders our life. We submit ourselves to this narrative, and we pursue it at any cost. And when that is stripped of us, stripped from us, there's a vulnerability to that. When things are no longer going to play out the way that we're expecting, the way that we're needing, the way that we are so married to because we think this is the thing that's going to save us. When we cling to these narratives, to these identities, to these ideologies, to buffer ourselves against the very trauma of existence because we think that's going to save us, and by the way, at least a side product of that is we buffer ourselves over and against one another, to be stripped of that, there's a vulnerability there, but it's also a gift. There's a freedom to it. Because in that vulnerability, in that freedom, well, one, we're free to fail. And that's scary. But there's also a solidarity in it. Because you are just as vulnerable as I am. And in that mutual vulnerability, and that kind of collective non-belonging, that collective misrecognition, we can all see ourselves imperfectly, but in this mutual vulnerability. And so yes, we are free to fail, but we are also free to build something. We're free to make a decision. I love the name of this community because I think it captures this really well. It's a watershed moment. A moment when we're confronted with the freedom and the trauma of existence. We can see each other. We can make a choice. We might be wrong, but we'd be wrong together. We can move forward. And that's what our weirdly nonchalant youth sitting in a tomb suggests. He says, you got to go back to the beginning now. You were already going back to the beginning because that's how life works. It's cyclical. It repeats. In any one lifetime, you're going to live thousands. Dying and being reborn. Different stages of life, relationships, jobs, identities, ways of understanding yourself. That's the hero's journey. You don't embark on it. It sort of overtakes you. So you're already always going back to the beginning. But how are you showing up? How are you showing up? And that's what this youth in the tomb is alluding to. He's like, you got to go back to Galilee. But when you go back to Galilee, you're going to encounter the resurrected Christ. And that's different. That is not going to go the way you think. Because, yes, repetition. It's going to be part of life. We're going to repeat these lives. We're going to repeat these cycles. And we talk about that a lot here. If you've gone through preface, you maybe seen the little loop-de-loop that Matt and Scott like. Talks about like death and epiphany and rebirth. We talk about the first and second half of life. You know, we talk about these cycles, but not every repetition is a resurrection. Because most of our repetitions, most of our attempts to kind of loop back around to the beginning and start again, they're like when we break up with someone or we break up with our employer, or we break up with a certain stage in life, but we don't break up with the way that we engage in life. And so we might have a new relationship, we might have a new job, but the way that we show up in those relationships or those jobs stays the same. Resurrection, it's not a reversal. It's not a going around. It's not ideological. It does not overcome or cover over the contradictions and antagonisms in our existence. It doesn't cover over the trauma. It leans in, goes through. And we see this in the other gospels, the other resurrection narratives, which are not quite as bizarre as the Mark one, but but I think are a little more bizarre than we often, for those of us who grew up in church, experienced with our felt boards in Sunday school. We don't have those in Greenhouse. There is a continuity and a discontinuity, and they're held in tension. Jesus is both recognizable and also shows up as a stranger. Mere repetition is mere recognition. We still see ourselves, or at least this image that we're projecting of ourselves over and over and over again. But resurrection, it's confusing. It's traumatic. And paradoxically, whatever healing or whatever we mean or could mean by wholeness is found up and held in tension with that trauma. I was talking about this with Blair, my good friend Blair. Nailed the announcements, by the way, Blair. We were talking about this a few months ago, and we were talking about these loops and these cycles and stuff like that. And she asked something profound. She says, if this is true, if what you're saying is true, and by the way, I don't know if it is, but going with it. But if this is true, how do we win? And I sat there for a second, and I didn't have anything, and then I blurted something out, and I think this. It says you have to lose on purpose. And I don't mean that in a self-sabotaging sort of way. I don't mean that in a self-deprecating sort of way. I don't mean that in a way, and hear this one most clearly, I don't mean that in a way that where you submit yourself to unnecessary abuse or trauma. That's not what I'm saying. Maybe the best example is actually one I used in a parenting series here a few years ago, and it's the game Bop It. You ever played Bop It? Kind of an annoying game. Because you can't win Bop It. It just goes faster and faster and faster until you lose. The only way to win, I would argue, win Bop It is you stop playing Bop It. You set it down. You opt out. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying in this. I'm not saying that, you can opt out of life or parenting or being in, a society. Because I'm not saying opt out of life, but it's a symbolic opting out. It's a death of sorts. It's a fundamental recontextualization of the way that you are showing up. To go back to the relationship example, there are absolutely times when you need to get out of the relationship you're in because it is problematic or abusive, or maybe you just aren't good for each other. That might be the right answer, but sometimes we just need to change the way that we are in the relationship. And that's a metaphor for this idea of resurrection wherein you stop trying to win. You stop pursuing this expectation of wholeness, of atonement, of salvation that you think is going to finally fulfill you. Because oftentimes, let's be honest, that's, whether it's the relationship or the job, that's the thing, right? That's the burden that we're placing upon our partner, that we're projecting upon them, is you're going to make me whole. And if you don't, well, literally or figuratively, there's going to be hell to pay. So this notion of resurrection, which, let me be clear here, if I haven't been yet, I'm contrasting resurrection from atonement. So resurrection then is a freedom. It's a traumatic freedom, but it's a freedom from the pursuit of happiness. Because pursuing happiness is exhausting, really, really tiring. Our whole country is built on it. And any number of statistics you can look at, it's like, that's not going well. We don't want happiness. I mean, we do want happiness, but my advice is no, we don't. There is something better than happiness. More traumatizing than happiness, but better. And that thing is joy. And happiness and joy aren't the same thing, because happiness is ideological. Happiness is this momentary papering over, covering over of the antagonisms and the contradictions and the trauma in life. And happiness is fine. I'm not saying that like happiness is bad. Go out and be sad. Like, no. Happiness is fine. Happiness is going to arrive in our lives at various times, and when it happens, enjoy it. Celebrate it. Be happy. Happiness is good. But when we treat happiness as an atonement, as this thing that's going to make us whole, it will inevitably disappoint us. But joy is different. joy goes through and in. It leans into the contradictions. It makes peace with them in a sort of way that's never going to quite feel right. But again, there's a freedom there, and it's that freedom I talked about. The freedom that is, well, it's traumatic and it's vulnerable, but it also frees us for a kind of authenticity that allows for a genuine solidarity. It's the freedom that allows us to be in solidarity with someone whose identity is radically different than ours, but who we can see is experiencing an unnecessary trauma, an exploitation, a marginalization. Joy names the kind of freedom that allows us to trust that either one, we don't know how this is going to end, and we're going to lean in anyway, or perhaps even more courageously, we do know how this is probably going to end, and it's not going to be this picture-perfect storybook ending. It might actually be like Luke Skywalker, who experienced the weight of the trauma of his life and his journey, and for whom it proved, at least for a season, too much for him. But here's what happened with Luke. So he meets Rey, and for a while it's just cynicism all the way down. And I get cynicism. I am cynical a lot. Cynicism and sarcasm, it's kind of like the default love language of an Enneagram 5. And that's what I am, so yeah. My wife's in the back, she knows that's true. But cynicism doesn't go far enough. Joy kind of takes us through cynicism and out the other side. And my suggestion, kind of what I want to leave you with this morning, is that in the end, Luke Skywalker experiences joy. He looks back on his life. He definitely knows the story about his life. Luke Skywalker, literally the epitome of the hero's journey. I mean, George Lucas was good friends with Joseph Campbell, the dude who invented this whole thing, and Luke Skywalker is the archetype. Luke knows how the story was supposed to end, and he knows it didn't end that way. He sees that. He sees Rey going down that same path, knowing full well that her story may well end just like his does. But he doesn't despair. At least that's not where he ends up. Cynicism despairs. Cynicism says, it's nihilistic, it's not worth it. But joy says, you know what? Even so, nevertheless, I'm going to choose to move forward. I'm going to choose to lean in. I'm going to choose solidarity. I'm going to choose kindness. I'm going to choose relationship. I'm going to choose love, faith, hope, especially love, though. Joy says, even so. So yeah, the hero's journey, you can't stop it. Like I said, you're going to go through it again and again and again. And sometimes you'll know you're going through it, sometimes you won't. And it's not going to bring you wholeness. It's not a formula. It's not math. It kind of just is. But there's a freedom on the other side of it. It's traumatic freedom. It's a freedom that's going to ask you to lean in, to be vulnerable, to not hide from the vulnerability that you see in yourself and that you see in the other. But it's in a vulnerability that's going to invite you to joy, invite you to say, even so, nevertheless, I'm in. I think that's how God is. I certainly think that's the God that we see in the person and work of Jesus Christ. And if that's how God is, well, shoot, might work for us too. Watershed, it's lovely to be with you in person. You two outside as well, and those of you online, I want to acknowledge you as well. I'm exhausted, so that's all for me. Grace and peace to you, and we will see you next week, kicking off our brand new series. Take care.